Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is Nick with Idaho Up, and today we're kicking off video number 2 of our 4-part video series. If you missed the first video, make sure you go check that out. I'll put a link to that right here. In this video, we're going to talk about everything to do with wiring. We're going to talk about wiring up the head unit, the steering wheel controls, and we're going to talk about whether or not you have the Boyo system and how to make it compatible either way. We're also going to talk about a head unit that you should absolutely stay away from if you're considering it for your C6. Again, if you need to get caught up, go check out video number 1 and make sure you like and subscribe. Now let's get into this. So both the JVC and the Sony are very capable receivers, but for the C6 Corvette, you absolutely need to stay away from the JVC, and I'll tell you why. I can also tell you that the display on the Sony is miles ahead of the JVC, and I can tell you this for a fact because I installed both these head units into my C6 prior to figuring out the undeniable issue with the JVC when installing it in this model of Corvette. And I got to thinking that this same issue might plague other stereos on the market when they're installed in the C6, so I wanted to tell you about it so you could save both your time and your money. So here's the issue with the JVC and what you need to look out for when you're shopping for a stereo for the C6. I'm willing to bet that if you're doing this install that 9 times out of 10 you're going to be using this dash kit from Metra unless you're doing some type of custom dash. The problem with the JVC is that it doesn't sit flush with the dash kit, and I'm sure you don't want an unfinished look on your Corvette. You'll notice that the JVC has a really slim edge on the front of the unit, and this is why it doesn't fit the dash kit properly. On the other hand, the Sony has a very thick edge, and this is what you want to look for when you're shopping for a stereo for your C6. Here's a quick comparison of both units in the dash kit so you can better see the fitment issue. Okay, now that you have a better idea what to look for when you're shopping for a stereo for your C6, let's get right into the detailed wiring aspect of this install. But before we do that, let's go ahead and cinch this dash kit down on this Sony unit, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, make sure you do so and hit that like button. It'll really help the channel out, and it'll help me put out more content to you in the future. With that said, let's knock this out. So regardless of what stereo system you have in your C6, the factory Boyo system or the non-Boyo system, if you want to retain your steering wheel controls, you're going to have to purchase a PAC interface. Another thing I like about the Sony head unit is that there's plenty of space to put that PAC interface underneath it during the install. Now this is a look of the PAC interface after I already wired it to the Sony head unit wires, but don't worry, I'm going to go over that wiring process. I just thought it would be handy to talk about a few things prior to doing that. Now I know this looks like a lot of wires, but keep in mind that most of them are pre-wired when you get your PAC interface, making the majority of them plug and play. All you have to do is connect these wires to your aftermarket head unit wires, and I'll show you how to do that all while sitting at your kitchen table. Now these wires right here plug directly into the car where we unplugged the factory head unit in my last video. Now in some cases when you upgrade your stereo in a C6, you're going to lose your factory door chime. But don't worry, PAC's got you covered, and that's what this wire is for right here. It plugs into an aftermarket door chime that's included in the kit. Now I installed the chime under the dash of the car, and I'll show you that when we get to the fourth video and we wrap everything up. As far as the plug and play wires go, you can't really mix them up because the plugs are all different sizes and will only fit into one spot, with the exception of one plug right here. This plug will plug into 2 spots, and it's dependent on how you're using the unit. And you'll notice that this one says amplified and this one says non-amplified. Now I've noticed that people tend to get confused here because they think if they're adding an aftermarket amplifier they should use the amplified plug, but it's actually the opposite. The reason for this is that the amplified plug is actually for C6s with the Boyo system, the factory amplified system. The only time you use this plug is if you have the factory amplified system in your C6. If you don't have the Boyo system or you're adding an aftermarket amplifier to your system, you're going to use the non-amplified plug. Because I have the Boyo system, if I later changed my mind and decided to add aftermarket amplifiers, I'd have to get behind the dash and swap this plug from amplified to non-amplified so I could bypass the Boyo's amplifier. Moving on, you'll notice that there's a set of RCA cables on the PAC that I have taped off. These cables are used for things like SUVs that have rear seat entertainment systems, but obviously in a Corvette you don't have rear seats, so just tape them off so they don't touch any metal. Okay, now we're just going to go back in time prior to me wiring the PAC together, and this is where we're going to wire the PAC wires to the aftermarket head unit wires. Prior to getting started, make sure the switches on the PAC unit are switched to the right position for your aftermarket radio. You'll notice that this one was switched to 2 because I had that JVC unit in it first, but now that it's a Sony unit, I'm switching it to 4. Now we're going to connect the PAC wires to the aftermarket head unit wires, and this is really just as simple as matching up the colors and soldering them together. If you've never soldered before, I am going to solder one wire on video, but after that I'll solder the rest off video, but we will talk about what each individual wire does. Soldering is really not a hard thing to do, so you shouldn't be weary of doing it. It's just a repetitive task that you do over and over again until all the wires are put together. It's also something that's not expensive to do. You can get all the tools I'm going to use in this video from any hardware store for relatively cheap. I do recommend that you stick around for our discussion about what each wire does, because I may help you avoid some mistakes and I may give you some tricks that'll help you out when you install the head unit in the vehicle later. We're going to start by using a pair of strippers to strip back the white wire on both the PAC wiring harness and the Sony wiring harness. We're also going to use some heat shrink tubing on all the wires so that after we're done soldering, there's no bare metal exposed. I like to cut my tubing in half so that it lasts longer. From here we're going to feather out the ends of the wires on both harnesses and then twist them together and hit them with the soldering gun and some solder. Now just heat up the wire with the soldering gun for a second and then push the solder into the wire and it'll bind it together. Now just let the solder cool down for a second prior to slipping the heat shrink tubing over it. If you don't do this, the heat shrink tubing tends to shrink down too early and you won't cover all the exposed wire, and then you have to cut the wire and resolder it. Now just use a heat gun to hit the heat shrink tubing and it'll shrink it down on that wire so that it doesn't move. And that's soldering in a nutshell. You just rinse and repeat for all the other wires. Okay, right here you're going to notice that all the speaker wires for the Sony head unit have been soldered to the correlating input wires on the PAC unit. You'll also notice that the solid color wires match up and the wires with the black lines match up as well. These are your negative and positives for all of your speakers, your left front, left rear, and right rear. Right here, the yellow, red, and black wires are soldered, and the yellow is the 12 volt, the red is the accessory, and the black is the ground. You're also going to notice that I soldered in a pigtail on the red wire. This is because I'm going to be running a forward-facing camera on the car, and I needed power for that camera. So this makes it easy when I go to install the radio in the car because I don't have to mess with the harness. I can just plug directly into this pigtail with the camera and then cover this spade clip with a larger piece of heat shrink tubing just to cover the metal. This is the purple wire with the white stripe, and this is the reverse output camera. So if you were running this PAC unit on a vehicle that had a factory reverse camera, this is the wire that would tell the reverse camera to come on when the vehicle was in reverse. Because the C6 doesn't have a factory reverse camera, I added another pigtail to this purple and white wire so that when I put the vehicle in reverse, the camera would turn on just as if it had a factory camera. This orange wire with the white stripe is the illumination wire. This wire tells the head unit to dim down at night with the rest of your dash lights when you turn on the headlights. This is your light green wire that goes to your parking brake. This is your blue wire with the white stripe, which is your remote turn-on wire that tells your amplifier to turn on. So in my case, where I'm running the Bose factory stereo, this wire is telling the Bose factory amp to turn on. If you're running an aftermarket stereo, you'd want to pigtail into this wire and it would tell your aftermarket amp to turn on. This is the steering wheel control output wire, and it plugs directly into the back of the head unit using a 3.5mm jack. Now I do want to caution you here because not all aftermarket head units have this 3.5mm jack. For example, the JVC unit that I hooked up before the Sony unit used this blue wire with the yellow stripe instead, and it was just soldered together like all the other wires. As you can see, because I'm not using it with the Sony head unit, I just folded it over on itself and used some electrical tape to cover the end. If you have a head unit that doesn't have a 3.5mm input for the steering wheel controls, then you would use this blue wire with the yellow stripe, and you would take some electrical tape and just cover the jack so that the metal wasn't exposed. I also want to let you know that the yellow line on this blue wire is very faint. It almost looks white, so don't accidentally hook it up to the remote turn on for the amplifier. If that wasn't enough to confuse you, there's this third solid blue wire that is not used. My assumption is that this wire is used on other non-GM PAC interfaces. So again, be careful not to confuse this wire with the other blue wires. This next wire, the pink wire titled the vehicle speed signal output, quite honestly, I don't know what this wire is for. I just soldered it to the other pink wire, and I didn't seem to have any problems with either the JVC unit or the Sony unit when I put them in my car. If you happen to know what this is, why don't you drop a comment below and educate the rest of us. And this last brown wire, titled the steering wheel control output key number 2, was not used in either installation of the JVC head unit or the Sony head unit, so I just took a piece of black electrical tape and taped it to the steering wheel control output that's on the 3.5mm jack. So guys, that covers the PAC interface. Now we're going to put that to the side and talk about the other wiring harness that plugs into the back of the Sony head unit. So this is a 6-channel head unit, meaning you can power a pair of subwoofers, a pair of front speakers, and a pair of rear speakers with the addition of aftermarket amplifiers. Now like I said, for this install we are retaining the Bose system with the factory amp, but I did want the option of switching over to aftermarket amps and speakers at a later time if I wanted to. It also has 3 camera inputs, and like I said, I'm going to be using 2 of them, one for a rear facing camera and one for a forward facing camera. The orange wires are used when you want to use two of the cameras for side view cameras. You would hook these up to your signal indicators, and when you turn left or right, they would interrupt the screen and show you what's on the left or right of your vehicle. To be completely honest with you, the whole reason I decided to go with the JVC unit before the Sony unit is because it had 4 camera inputs, and at the time I planned on having a rear view camera, a front view camera, and 2 side view cameras. But after I got into it and took the glass off the side view mirrors, I realized it was going to be a real challenge, and I didn't think I could fit the camera plugs through the mirrors and into the cab of the vehicle without really damaging something and altering the factory look, which is something I didn't want to do, so I abandoned that and went back to the idea of having just a front camera and a rear camera. So if you're not going to be doing side view cameras, just get some electrical tape and tape off those orange wires. Okay, now that we have all the wiring complete, we're just going to take some zip ties and clean up the harness so everything tucks away nicely when we put it in the dash. And that's a wrap for video 2, guys. On video 3, we're going to talk about forward-facing cameras and backup cameras, and you're going to want to tune in because I'm going to cover 3 different camera options, and there's definitely one you want to stay away from. If you're finding these videos helpful, make sure you like and subscribe. This is Nick with Idaho Up, and until next time, keep up.